right, welcome everyone to another merge-based cybersecurity video. Today we're going to be talking about the SEC announcement that provided some guidance on how large publicly traded businesses need to deal with cybersecurity and reporting. And with that context, we're going to talk about government legislation in general around cybersecurity and how some small, medium-sized businesses as well as larger organizations react to that over the next few years. With me today is Oscar Vandermeer, CEO of MergeBase, and joining us is also Kelly West, newly our CTO. Welcome, everyone. So I'm just going to get started. In general, we're with the context of the SEC getting more involved in this. Governments overall in different countries are getting more concerned about cybersecurity and the software supply chain. So how do we see that going forward, Oscar?
Yeah, we're actually seeing a lot of movement. Governments are notoriously kind of slow movers, but actually they're somehow breaking the mold a little bit here because in the US, for example, we saw that they introduced a new cybersecurity strategy from the federal government in March, and then actually came out with the implementation plan early July. I think it's been that hardly ever happens, right? And so we're seeing a movement in the European Union, in the US. The US is clearly leading kind of in this area, but then also smaller countries like Canada, Japan, Germany, other countries are also doing a lot of things in this area.
Right. So I guess at a high level, why are they getting more concerned about cybersecurity and software supply chain specifically?
Yeah. Well, for instance, the European Union quotes in one of their recent reports that cybercrime annually exceeds 5.5 trillion euros, and so euro kind of is roughly equivalent to a US dollar. So this is a huge number. Just a few years ago, total crime-related damages across the globe was estimated to be $10 trillion, right? With the biggest chunk of that essentially being corruption. And so, so really, cybercrime is gunning for the number one spot here in total crime damages, and really is overtaking drugs and other crimes. So you can imagine, when that's happening, what a concern that creates for governments. And then secondary, or in some countries primary, is of course the kind of defense or security implications as well. I mean, we're seeing in the war in the Ukraine, for instance, there's quite a lot of cyber warfare and electronic warfare going on. So it becomes a key component of defending your country as well.
Yeah, and I think related to that on the government front, as an aspect of defense, we've seen more often states as bad actors where the attack vector is actually against companies in order to disrupt the economy, where it's not a government attacking a government, but rather, a state-sponsored bad actor is actually disrupting the economy with attacks against private companies. And so the kind of defense that's necessary then is necessarily distributed amongst those companies.
So you were saying that there's sort of a general direction that governments are taking with cybersecurity. What's the sort of future of government involvement with the cybersecurity industry?
I would like to narrow it down from cybersecurity kind of globally to really software supply chain attacks, because software supply chain attacks have really been increased tenfold over the last 2 years, and that's what I think a critical focus is on now, both in the industry and from governments. In terms of what's the common approach, I think the one common approach is that there is effectively in the software supply chain there's this risk gap, right? So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what the software supply chain is. Well, you're building an application either as an organization yourself, or a software vendor is building an application for you. What now tends to happen is that they source a lot of the code in that application from other places, right? And so that's your software supply chain. Mostly that is now open source, and there's contributors to open source software all around the globe. You've got these open source projects, and they're incorporated into applications in the form of libraries and frameworks. And the problem is those could have known vulnerabilities, and those are critical attack vector at the moment. And so that's really what governments are concerned about. And there has been this risk management gap, right? Because the vendors who created applications and would sell their applications often put in their contracts that they're not liable, if there's breaches, right? And so they are not taking any responsibilities. And then the buyers, on the other hand, of that software, they don't have any knowledge of how the internals of the software, and so they're saying, well, I can't take any responsibility on the risks for this because I just don't know what risks there are and how to manage them. And so the end result is that nobody was managing the risk. The vendor wasn't not doing it contractually, and then the buyer was not doing it because they didn't have the tools and the information to do it well. So this created this huge gap that is now being exploited. And so the first thing that governments are doing is trying to close that gap. And
Right.
they're doing
So
that by saying to someone, in this case, the buyer, you have to take ownership of this and you have to make sure that your vendor's giving you either guarantees or sufficient information for you to manage the risk. Yeah. So
sure.
that's kind of, but then, so that's where the commonality starts, but also ends, because then exactly how do you do that? Different countries will go into different level of detail around that. In some countries, it's basically, yeah, well, now you're on your own. And in some other countries like the US, they provide you with very, very, specific guidelines.
Right.
If I can just add to what Oscar's saying, I think the key phrase that Oscar used is that the challenges in software supply chain are that there are known vulnerabilities. They're actually published vulnerabilities. And so the information is readily available to cyber criminals. And so when government is focusing on the software supply chain, it's a very practical approach to protecting software, because these known vulnerabilities mean that they are higher probability areas to be attacked, but they're also easier to defend against. With something like an SCA tool like MergeBase, you can easily protect against those known and published vulnerabilities. And so the software supply chain as a focal point for governments is both because it's a higher area of threat and because it's a practical area to protect against. And yet a lot of companies, I think, aren't yet doing that.
So, how does this impact and medium-sized businesses as well as large businesses in terms of requirements day to day? How is this going to change practices, and what are the types of tools you need involved in order to implement these sort of changes?
So, well, definitely, I think what we're seeing is that governments are getting very concerned, and they're creating legislation and regulations that initially is really targeting larger organizations. And for instance, the announcement from the SEC is for SEC regulates publicly traded companies in the US. So they will have to provide vulnerability reporting on an annual basis, and they will have to have certain procedures for security incidents as well, and reporting and disclosing that information. So, but that's for larger organizations. So we are also seeing that specific areas, like for instance, the FDA has introduced regulations for medical devices, right? And there's specific regulations in the power industry, for instance, in the US. The European Union is introducing specific legislation as well. Japan has just recently launched a guideline on how to use SBOM more targeted at multinational organizations that supply their goods in countries like the US and the European Union. So there's a lot of different things. First, going after large companies, but very quickly it will trickle down to smaller companies, because who often supplies those large companies? Smaller companies, right? And so there are larger organizations are looking at their own supply chain, and basically the regulations that they're responsible for, they're starting to downstream that to their suppliers. And so that's probably the next step. And then just from a general risk management perspective, I think a 5.5 trillion, problem, I think basically impacts everybody, and criminals are increasingly targeting small organizations. And that's even made easier, because they have AI now as well as a tool that helps them do that more effectively and to scale up their operation and do what they were doing with large organizations, but now applying that using AI to smaller organizations as well.
Right. So you're mentioning AI. So how do you think AI is going to be impacting the cybersecurity industry and and as well as software supply chain? If it's AI, so AI is developing. So over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I think that just to recognize that right now AI is in its infancy and hasn't been a major factor yet in cybersecurity, and yet it is likely. You mentioned a 5 to 10 year timeline in technology. That's a very that's a
Time.
long timeline to try and make predictions again. But we can assume that it's going to become important, and that we're going to see, sort of three areas where AI is important when it comes to cybersecurity. And the first is all around privacy and confidentiality. And that's partly because of the number of AI tools out there. And when it comes to generative AI, they're often fed with a lot of information. So that information then, is it intended to be published? Is it intended to still be confidential and in a tool? What are the new attacks that are possible against a tool like that? There's a whole area of uncertainty, both around the legal implications of ownership of information and around the protection of confidential and private information when it comes to AI tools. Another area that a major focus is going to be the offensive use of AI. AI can be used as a tool to come up with new attack vectors or potentially to take a known vulnerability and scale up the idea of how to attack that vulnerability across many different companies who may have that vulnerability. And certainly that's going to have a clear relationship to software supply chain management, since effectively you feed information into AI systems, you can feed in known vulnerabilities. As a result, you could basically do the ROI of different types of attacks you can make based on those vulnerabilities out there in the world. Finally, a third area where we're going to see AI have an impact is on the defensive side. Even a tool like MergeBase has for our SCA analysis has aspects of AI within the tool in order to be able to defend against all of the known vulnerabilities. And we're going to see those capabilities being built out over the next few years in order to make AI a powerful tool to defend against the cybersecurity threats as well.
What's the best way you can start stepping up if you're a small or medium-sized business or even a large business that is already the subject of some of these regulations? What can you do to get started?
I think the important thing is that you get a process in place. And so I think a lot of governments are already helping. So you need to, it's a very much a process-oriented approach, and then it will require some tools. So everybody nowadays has a firewall, has some other tools. Often, I think what they don't have is detecting known vulnerabilities, right? And that's why we've seen a tenfold increase over the last 2 years, because everybody has kind of some of the bare bones basics in place, but what is the next step? Well, I think it's to take care of your known vulnerabilities. And that's why we've seen a tenfold increase in 2 years, because most organizations still don't have that in place. And of course, having a known vulnerability in an application sounds like, trivial matter, but it's like, you have a house and you say, I don't want to, get somebody breaking into my house, but you just leave a few doors and windows open. Like you might have locked the front door, but how about the back door? How about a window in the bedroom or something like that? And if it's easy to spot, like you're not, your house is not very well protected, and that's effectively the state of where a lot of organizations are with their applications. There's known vulnerabilities in them that effectively could easily be leveraged by criminals to breach the organization.
Get started with something to get to detect known vulnerabilities. That's software composition analysis tool, and MergeBase is obviously a software composition analysis tool. So if you wanted to get started with MergeBase and you try it out before you get a full process in place for your company, how could you get started?
Go to mergebase.com and take a free trial, or set up a meeting with one of our salespeople to talk about how we could best tailor that for your organization.
Well, thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Kelly. Learned a lot today. And like Oscar said, mergebase.com/free trial if you'd like to get started. Other than that, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Delan.
Thank you. Thank you.